Hi, welcome back. Um, One of the first things I want to talk about with Catcher in the Rye is point of view, and how point of view is, an American characteristic. And why would it be an American characteristic? Why being first person to tell your story, your personal experience, and how that has value? What you start to see with people like Catcher in the Rye, and I'm going to use Melville's Moby Dick as an example here because um, Moby Dick is the great American novel. You could say that about The Great Gatsby because The Great Gatsby epitomizes the American dream, and it's, in a very slender piece, it has all the elements there that you would want out of an American classic. But as far as being like an ultimate best book, American classic that the closest you could possibly get to, that could hold a candle to British literature, would be Melville's Moby Dick. And in fact, Salinger felt like there was Melville, and then there was him, and then there was like this desert, this wasteland between them. And I don't think Salinger's writing was any better than uh, certainly not Willa Cather or Fitzgerald. But I think you'll see the point he's making as far as being completely authentic. And by being authentic, in his point of view, in his voice, there's a hint of satirical voice there. In the very beginning of Moby Dick, this would be a great book for you to read, but I don't even know that I could do a course on this because it is so long. This would take like an entire. If this is all you ever read for AP though, and you could do very well, but maybe sometime in the future I will do that. But the very opening, he says, "Call me Ishmael." Why Ishmael? Well, Ishmael is the son of Abraham and Hagar. It's not Sarah's son because Sarah couldn't at this time have children. She didn't have children until way later. And so he ends up becoming this disinherited. And think about like the Puritans. He's separate, a separatist. Now, God doesn't abandon him, even though his father does. And I think that's probably why this is the story, but also just the attitude of call me Ishmael. He's not very committed to who he is. And in fact, it doesn't even really matter, who he is. It doesn't, he's a wanderer. His name doesn't really mean anything to him. And so this is how he begins his story. And I think what's really, what you start to hear from point of view is especially when he kind of satirizes his own Christian beliefs. He's this good Presbyterian, and who does he end up with but, this pagan cannibal, Queequeg. And Queequeg actually becomes the hero of the story. Of course, just like Catcher, people at this time didn't get it. And I'll give you a little example. As Queequeg's practicing his Ramadan, Ishmael tries to be very accepting of it, and he talks about how tolerant he is. But listen to the language of the way that he talks about Queequeg's religion. I cherish the greatest respect towards everybody's religious obligations, never mind how comical. And he really thinks it's kind of funny that Queequeg puts up these idols and prays to them. And he says that there was Queequeg now certainly entertaining the most absurd notions about Yojo and his Ramadan. But what of that? Queequeg thought he knew what he was about, I suppose. He seemed to be content, and so there let him rest. All our arguing with him would not avail. Let him be, I say. And he always kind of goes back to I say, he's reminding you over and over that this is his point of view, and that actually he's not to be taken that seriously. And the same thing I think occurs with Catcher in the Rye, and I think this is where people have problems with Catcher in the Rye. they take the text way too literally. They don't understand the humor behind it. Catcher in the Rye is a funny book. It's hilarious. It's very sad, but it's also very funny. If you get to the first scene, where he's with this professor, and his professor's reading back his paper to him, and it just you know this kind of person, and how does Holden respond in just a very detached, yeah, I know what you mean. I'm terrible. I really, boy, I should get it together. And you can't help but laugh at this kid because part of it is just he's smarter than the situation, and he's not completely drawn into it. So when you have people who claim to be doctorates of education, and they don't understand reading literature, there's something wrong with that. There really is something wrong if people just take the text literally and they have a problem with reading classics. That means they don't understand it. If they understood it, there is no way that they would ever say this isn't valuable. This is the most valuable thing you can do with education. And so, at the very end of this chapter, he brings up, he tries to convert Keequeg, which is what you're supposed to do. And that, wait, let me tell you about my Christian God and Jesus and all of that. And so Keequeg's listening to this, and he's, and Keequeg, by the way, shows a tremendous amount of humility, juxtaposed to the self-righteous people in the novel. Keequeg is the humble one. So Melville would have loved this character, right? I mean, I'm talking about Salinger. Salinger would have loved this character, and he would have gotten it. Now, other people didn't get it, and unfortunately, Melville died just like Fitzgerald did, thinking he was a failure, knowing that he wrote a masterpiece. He said, he wrote a wicked book, and he feels as spotless as a lamb. He knew it was going to be controversial, because he's satirizing religious ideas. The same thing happened with the next book I want to teach, Jude the Obscure, except it's even worse. The bishop burned Jude the Obscure. He was pointing out all of the corruption and the things that happen, and of course the church doesn't want it. They don't like that. They don't want to hear the truth. So as Keequeg is listening to Ishmael's ideas about Christianity, he says it wasn't working because in the first place he somehow seemed dull of hearing on that important subject, unless considered from his point of view. And in the second place, he did not more than 1/3 understand me, couch my ideas simply as I would, and finally, he no doubt thought he knew a great deal more about true religion than I did. He looked at me with sort of condescending concern and compassion. And then he says, as though he thought it was a great pity that such a sensible young man should be so hopelessly lost to evangelical pagan piety. So I hope that's enough to get you at least interested in Moby Dick, that it's a lot more than what people think it is. So back to Catcher. As we're listening to Holden, and it's his point of view, what you have to think about is what he's not saying. He's trying to brush off in the very beginning that he's like, everyone is at this game except him. Now, I will say that another American characteristic is to kind of go on a quest, a personal quest. And if you think back to the lecture I did in the very beginning when I was talking about the spiritual aspect and the detachment and the renouncing of the world, the third thing is exile. And here he's been ostracized by his team, which he puts it very lightly that he lost all the fencing equipment. And then he says that none of them talked to him, and it was really funny, to tell you the truth. And I don't think that he thought it was funny at all. In fact, I think that's what is kind of the catalyst for him feeling like he's got to get out of here now, you know. And so when you take him literally, you know, it's, you have to remember that he's trying to justify himself. He is really trying to make himself feel better about not wanting to be a part of the community, by not wanting to be with anybody else, not having any friends. These people are phonies. I don't want to be a part of it. But you'll see throughout the text that he also has a very hard time with being alone. And he's constantly contradicting himself too. You know, so in the beginning, when he's talking about Pensy, and I think what's makes something really funny is sometimes the fact that it is inappropriate. That's what comedy is. That's what Steve Carell's character said in The Office when he got onto him and said, you know, that's inappropriate. And he said, I was being funny. And he said, it's inappropriate. And he says, that's what funny is, you know. But what also is kind of ironic about comedy is usually it's because you say something that everyone else is thinking, but it's a bold thing to say, because that's not proper or appropriate. And sometimes the truth, just like language, sometimes you actually do say what you mean. And so as he starts off talking about Pensy, and by the way, you know, he brings up Thomas Hardy. He brings up a few authors that he respects, and one of them is Thomas Hardy. Thomas Hardy is like Melville, but worse. I mean, he's very facetious. And so, of course, that's coming up. But he said, you know, Pensy has this advertisement that since 1888, we've been molding boys into splendid, clear-thinking young men, strictly for the birds. They don't do any damn more molding at Pensy than they do at any other school. And I didn't know anybody there that was splendid and clear-thinking at all. Maybe 2 guys, if that many. And they probably came to Pensy that way. And I love that remark about school, because it is true. There are some private schools that, you know, some of my students went to, and they said, you know, there wasn't like the teachers weren't any better than us, and you know, but paying the money, and you're also getting people who have had a stronger educational background. So it does seem like everyone is doing academically better. But later on, he does also contradict himself when he says that he's been kicked out of Pensy, and it's kind of like he says, you know, Pensy's very academic. It really is. So you have to see that there's probably a little bit of an attachment to the school, though he doesn't want to admit it. And this is written about, it's supposed to be Valley Forge. People from Valley Forge that knew Salinger said you marched everywhere. It was the guys, they recognized the guys that he talks about, like Alki. You knew these characters. You knew he was talking about his experience at Valley Forge. And as much as he resented it, he did end up writing the school song that's still sung today. And you can see that it's kind of satirizing. It's this, you know, glorifying the school, but also kind of satirizing it at the same time. And it's just a lot of fun for people to sing, and they still do it. So, and I already talked about, you know, his brother, and he doesn't talk about the one who died yet. But then you find out that there's the wound. You know, anytime you're looking at even a movie, you know, when you're looking at the character, something like Good Will Hunting, there's a wound there. There's something maybe abusive or something tragic that happened, and now this person is kind of gone off course. But not, like Tolkien said, not everybody who wanders is lost. And just like, you know, as far as a spiritual practice, sometimes the exile, the leaving, I think it was, I can't remember who said this, it's like something Day-Lewis, but, you know, selfhood is a walking away, and love is proved in letting go. And so this is still like an American characteristic, because think about what people had to do. They had to leave their, kind of traditional church and start over. And as they started over, they had to kind of make things up as they go, and that's what happened with the beginning of different Protestant religions as well, because they just kind of, some people said, well, we're going to interpret it this way, or we're going to do our doctrine this way, or whatever, and it just kept breaking off and breaking off. But that's uniquely American, to do that, which is why Melville's Ishmael is such a character. So he has this wound. He doesn't seem like the type that wants to be in prep school in the beginning. And I think I may have mentioned this. If you're looking at it as an American dream somewhere, and even though this isn't about the American dream, because it's a classic American novel, that is a reoccurring theme, and you can always make an argument or a case about it. Let's look at it like kind of turning that around. Usually it's the poor that wants to achieve. Well, what if it's the opposite problem? What if your parents are wealthy and the expectation that you are going to be, what's considered a prominent professional, like a doctor or lawyer, and that's just not you. That's never going to be you. And it turns into an identity crisis. And this is also kind of like what was going on with Holden, is like the Peter Pan syndrome. He doesn't want to grow up. When he thinks about Pensy, and if he thinks, like, if I could think of one moment that was really good, that I would want to keep with me, it was just that night that he and a couple of guys were throwing the football around. And he said, it kept getting later and later and later. And I think you can always, or you could think of a time in your life when you were a kid and you're outside and you're playing with your friends. And it's, you don't care about supper, you don't care about any of that. And the sun's going down and it's getting later and later. And you're going to have to stop doing what you're doing, but you don't want it to end. I think that is what it's like to realize that your childhood is over, and you can't really name it or say, or some of us can. Some of us coming of age moments could say, that was the night my childhood was over. But it's kind of a gradual loss of innocence for all of us. And here he is at a time in his life when his hormones are probably raging, and he's wanting to mature. He's interested in girls. He wants to be the good-looking, cool guy, but he's just not. And yet he doesn't want to have to just give up that night that he spent throwing a football around with his buddies. Because that is when you are absolutely in the moment. And that moment is priceless. It's golden. And then it goes away for all of us. And usually we'd have no idea we weren't paying attention to it. It just kind of passed us by. Life passes us by like that. And he knows that probably because his younger brother has died. And when someone dies who's close to your age, if you have a friend from school, what does it do but remind you of your own mortality? This is why in Hamlet, if you ever look at like a playbill or something of Hamlet, there's always that skull there. That's always when he recognizes that he knows this person who had died, and he says, "We grew up together. We were kids. We played." And then he sees, I'm alive and he's gone. What's the next thought is, I'm next. Or if you hear about someone who dies, in high school or something like that, you realize it really could happen to me too. And depending, some people have very clear faith and clear views on what the afterlife is going to be, but most of us don't really pretend to know those types of things. It's just like, I hope, but I don't really know for sure. And so this is where he's at. It's almost like a existential crisis too, which I'll point out later on when we get closer to that. So as you're reading this and you're getting accustomed to his voice, just remember that, look for contradictions. Look for, that he's not always saying exactly what he means. And what is he not saying that we still hear, because we're not just taking his words literally, but we're looking at him through the whole picture, and figuring out, well, he did say this, so that really contradicts this. How is he really emotionally feeling? How would you feel if everyone ostracized you and you couldn't, your team couldn't play the game because you lost all the equipment? At that age, what your peers think of you is like everything. And as much as you try to blow it off, it's still, I don't think it's a coincidence that is kind of the event that kicks off this whole madman business that he talks about. So I just want to finish this chapter just by reading this section. So he's going to go say goodbye to Mr. Spencer. He doesn't absolutely have to do this, but I think there's a part of him that feels lonely and wants to see Spencer. Now, you don't get that impression when he actually gets there, but you'll kind of see that Spencer does mean well. So he's there and it's cold, and he says, I ran all the way to the main gate, and then he says he's quite a heavy smoker, for one thing. That is, I used to be. They made me cut it out here, and I grew 6.5 inches last year. That's practically how I got TB and came out here for the goddamn checkups and stuff. I'm pretty healthy though. So he almost has TB, and then he's very healthy though. But he grew a lot. So physically he's going through a lot. And then he also mentioned somewhere that he also already had gray hair. All right. So anyways, as soon as I got my breath back, I ran across Route 204. It was icy as hell, and I damn near fell down. I didn't even know what I was running for. I guess I just felt like it. So you see that kind of childlike quality. After I got across the road, I felt like I was sort of disappearing. It was kind of a crazy afternoon, terrifically cold, and no sun out or anything, and you felt like you were disappearing every time you crossed a road. So I think that's a big symbolic just image of the coming of age, where you're crossing over. And I've talked about coming of age in other courses, but I have to assume that you haven't seen them. So I'll talk about it more later, because I'm going to kind of run out of time here. But this is a series of growing up, a gradual series of growing up. Usually comes from something that's disappointing. You have an ideal image of yourself when you're young, and especially when you're really cute and little and everyone loves you. And then you go to school, and what happens, people for no reason are making fun of your clothes. And you realize that the world is not the place you thought it was, because the place you thought it was, hopefully if you came from a good home, was a safe and secure and encouraging place. And then it's like, golly, these people are mean. But it, unfortunately, it gets worse. But that's what gradually makes you have to change your point of view and grow. And so that night, that image of him playing ball, and they just wanted to keep going. It's getting darker and darker and darker. And finally, somebody, an adult, sticks his head out the window and says, y'all need to cut it out. And it's those kind of moments, too, that stop the imagination of a child. I think children are born with a huge imagination and very creative. And then over time, as they get in line and do this and do that, and you have to do certain things at lunch, kids can't even eat, because to get them to settle down in 30 minutes, and they want to play. They don't know how to do that. And that structure really damages them, I think, in a way. And of course, he's at a very structured prep school, and so was Salinger. and now he's disappearing. With this is another school he's been kicked out of. So in the next lecture, I'll get to what I think is probably the funniest part of literature I've ever read, and that's his encounter with the teacher, Mr. Spencer. All right, thanks. Bye.